Okay, Paul, I think we can get started. I know you want to talk to us about your film journey, but before that, like I said before, I would like to make just a small introduction about you. So, yes. So, for those who don't know, Paul Schrader is an American film director, screenwriter, and film theorist. He is one of the New Hollywood main figures because he wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. Both his screenplays and his films are characterized by these obsessed, self-destructive characters that go in a violent journey, and this journey usually ends with an act of redemption. Visually, he has a very strong visual style due to an expressionist use of color, shadows, and camera angles. However, the interest of Paul Schrader in cinema was even through a more intellectual than emotional way. That is, as he was raised in a Calvinistic, morally very strict environment, he was not able to see films until he was 17 years old. And around that time, he started to see the European intellectual cinema, like of the Ingmar Bergman one or Godard. Then he met film critic Pauline Kael, and thanks to her friendship, he entered in film school and became a film critic for the Los Angeles Free Press. Then from film criticism he went to screenwriting, from screenwriting he went to film directing, and now he's today with us to give this masterclass. So Paul, whenever you feel ready, you can start talking about your film journey.
Thank you for coming. Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I had there are a lot of things to talk about. We can talk about the technology today, the new configuration of exhibition. We can talk about my films. We can talk about film study and film scholarship. We can talk about how you raise money, and that will sort of depend on you because I will just we'll start to open up and see where the questions lead us. But my church, in the 1920s, in the middle of the Jazz Age, when movies were at their most daring, my church, like some other churches, issued a prescription against theater attendance. And in fact, it was because churches were prescribing or forbidding members from going to the theaters that Hollywood, in fact, started its own code in the 1930s. So, so when I was growing up, I never saw a film, but then I didn't know anybody else who had either, so I didn't know I was missing that much. And I didn't start seeing films until I was in college. I went to religious college and seminary, Calvin, and it was the European cinema of the '60s, and Bergman and Bresson, Godard, Antonioni, Truffaut, and that was the music that was playing when I walked in the room. And you always loved the music that you were listening to when you first fell in love. And I think the same thing is true about movies. You fall in love, you always love the movies you fell in love with. And after me was the intellectual cinema of Europe, not American genres or films that kids like to watch. So I came as an adult, and I came as a very serious adult. And but in my background, there wasn't much of an opportunity to see films. So I had to, I had to go to New York for a summer just to watch movies, so I could see these films I was reading about. And through a kind of coincidence, I met Pauline Kael, who was then probably the most powerful critic in the country, and she sort of became my mentor. And after I went over there to her house because a friend of mine knew her. And I hadn't seen many films, but we talked into the night. And we drank a lot, and I ended up on the sofa. And the next morning, she said to me, you know, you don't want to be a minister, you want to be a film critic, and we're going to stay in touch. And eventually she got me into UCLA Film School, and that was how I got from there to there. So it's been about 50 years since I graduated. Something very interesting happened in March of 1969. I was a critic for the counterculture paper, the LA Free Press, and I went to a screening of Ray Sullivan's Pickpocket, a press screening. You know, it was only 75 minutes long, but it changed the course of my life in two ways. First, I didn't think there was any connection between the sacred traditions of my upbringing and the profane pleasures of my current life as a film student. And then I saw this film, and I realized that there was a connection, but it was a connection of style, not of content. And that serious contemplative filmmakers around the world were using the same tools. And it was that insight that caused me 2 years later to complete a book called Transcendental Style in Film, which I've now updated and has been reissued this year. But the other thing that happened in that screening was that I didn't think there was a place for me in motion pictures. I was just too serious. And I was living in a house with 4 other UCLA students who were making a film for Roger Corman, a Becker film, called Naked Angels. And I just thought this was all so déclassé and so vulgar. And I thought, you know, I had a very lofty notion of myself as a critic, and I thought, you know, we'll tell you when you make a good film. But then I saw this movie, and I said, I could make a film like that. You know, he writes in a journal, he goes out to steal some stuff, writes in a journal, meets his neighbor, writes in a journal, the cops come and see him. I said, I could make that, I could write that film. And 3 years later, I did write that film, and it was called Taxi Driver. And so, on that morning in May of 1969, you know, 2 seeds fell into a petri dish, and one grew into critical enterprise, and the other grew into a creative filmmaking enterprise. And it took almost 50 years for those 2 paths to meet. And then they met a year and a half ago with a film called First Reformed, in which I tried to use the style I'd written about 45 years before. Previously, people had tried to compare my films to that book, and I said, no, they're nothing. My films are not spiritual films. They're full of sex and violence and action and empathy, and these are not in the Transcendental Toolkit. But about 3 years ago, I was speaking with Pavel Pavlovsky. I had just given him an award for Ida, the Polish film about the nun. And we were talking about spirituality in movies, and he, and after that I walked uptown to my condo. And as I walked uptown, I said to myself, it's time to write that script you swore you would never write. It's time to write a spiritual film. And once I had made that intellectual decision, then the rest of it started to fall into place. And And then the shift from criticism to writing came about also in a rather practical way, because I was a number of things were going wrong. My marriage had fallen apart, and I didn't have any money, and I was getting in a very, very black place. And I was more or less living in my car and just going around with all these black thoughts. And there was a gun in the car. And I had this pain in my stomach. And I had a bleeding ulcer at the age of 25. And I went to the hospital, and I realized in the hospital that I hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. And the image of a taxi cab came into my mind. This metaphor, the symbol, this yellow coffin floating through the open sewers of the city with this young man trapped inside. This young man who looks like he's surrounded by people, but is absolutely alone. And I knew I had to write about him because I was becoming him. And if I didn't write about him, I was in danger. So I got involved in screenwriting as self-therapy. I was not writing this for anybody, any market. And after I wrote it, I put it in a drawer and drove around the country to just sort of get my bearings and my health back. And then I was, about 6 months later, I was in Tennessee, and I got a letter from my brother who had a similar situation in Japan, who lost his marriage, lost his wife, lost his religion, lost his job. And he had taken to watching Yakuza movies. And he sent me a long, long letter about Yakuza movies. And Bruce Lee had recently died, and people were talking about who was going to be the next Bruce Lee. And I thought to myself, maybe it's not a Chinese, maybe it's Japanese. And me and my brother wrote that script, and as it so happened, it went into an auction, and it sold for the highest price to date. And all of a sudden, in the stroke of a pen, I was off and running. Just to wrap this section up, so of course I went back to criticism, and I was writing a review on Brian De Palma's film Sisters, and I interviewed him, and we started playing chess because he played chess. And one day I said to him, I wrote a script. He said, oh, no, please don't. I said, okay, I just, wanted to tell you that I wrote a script. So he said, okay, I'll read it. And he read it, and he gave it to Scorsese. He said, this is not for me, but I think this might be for you. And Marty read it, and we started that part of the journey, and it took 2 or 3 years to get that film on, because all of us, we couldn't get it made with who we are. So we all had to have some kind of success. Marty had a successful film with Alice and Olivia. De Niro won an Oscar for Godfather 2. I had that screen sale of Yakuza, and the producers won an Oscar for The Sting. And now, all of a sudden, we were a hot package, and Columbia decided to finance that film. So that's sort of my beginning place. But I'd rather sort of get some sense of where any of you want this conversation to go.
Okay. I'll start with the first question. About your film criticism period. Jean-Luc Godard once wrote that the first films that members of the French New Wave made were the film reviews they made to the Cahiers do Cinema. His phrase was writing a quote, writing was already a way of making films, for the difference between writing and directing is quantitative, not qualitative. As you and Peter Bogdanovich are the only film critics turned into film directors in the American New Wave, I ask you if you feel the same about your own writings.
Well, Peter was not so much a film critic as he was a film historian. And of course, once I started making films, I had to give up criticism because, no matter what you say in a review, the people you're talking about will think it's insufficient. And you have to go to those same people to get your films made. So you just can't do it. But you can do kind of theoretical criticism, which I kept doing. And the trick of criticism and filmmaking are very different. And they're actually in opposition to each other. And you have to resist the temptation. I'm fond of saying that a film critic is like a medical examiner, someone who does autopsies. He wants to get that body on the table, he wants to open it up, and he wants to determine how and why it lived. And a filmmaker is like a pregnant woman. All she cares about is making sure that the child is delivered alive and healthy. So if you let the critic into the birthing room, he will kill that child. And you have to be careful. You have to leave room for the mystery, for things you don't understand. You're writing, you say, I don't know why he does this, but I know he does it. And if things make too much sense, that can be a detriment. And so you have to bake in the mystery and keep the critic at an arm's reach. That's particularly true when you're writing and you're directing. After you're all done, you can see the pattern, but still there's some mysteries. But in First Reform, once I decided to write that script, I just went back and looked at the films of that nature that I liked. And so I took the main character from Country Priest, Brayso. I took the setting from Winter Live by Bergman. I took the ending from Our Dead by Dreyer. I took a levitation sequence from Tarkovsky. And then I wrapped it all together with the barbed wire of Taxi Driver. And what I didn't realize was how illogical it was becoming. Because it all seemed so logical, but it was the obsessive, maniacal thrust of that Taxi Driver from 50 years before that infected that film and provided it with the craziness that it needed. Otherwise, it would just have been an intellectual exercise.
You talked a few while ago about your new edition of Transcendental Style in Film. I've read that new edition and I was amazed because in the introduction you talk about the Portuguese film director Pedro Costa quite a few times, and I would like to ask you, do you like Pedro Costa's cinema and why?
Well, I do. What's the one with the horse in the title?
Horse Money.
Horseman?
Horse Money.
Yeah. Horse Money. Oh yeah, that's the one I like most. I really, like his use of color. I like the, how it really works in darkness. But that's a very interesting argument when you start withholding things from the viewer, which is what slow cinema is about, which is what is transcendental style is about. You're withholding things that the viewer has come to expect. Perhaps it's music, usually is, because music tells you exactly how to feel. Movies are so desperate for your love. They grab you by the lapel and say, here's some beautiful people, and here's some car crashes, and here's music to tell you how to feel all the time. And so you gotta take things away from the viewer if you want the viewer to be active on his own. So you take away those music cues, you take away those camera moves, you take away those editing cues that tell the viewer which character is most important right now. So if I just have a shot of two people, like they do in the new Romanian cinema, like in 4:3:2, these two girls, one is camera right, one is camera left, and they're talking, and there's no cuts. Well, at some point, the viewer's going to decide who's more interested in. Am I more interested in the one that's talking, or am I more interested in the one that's listening? Well, that makes the viewer start to become like a filmmaker. And the same thing, like with the Bell Tower films, where let's take the opening. Let's have a hypothetical opening. So you have a field, and it's a great grassy field, and there's some cows, and there are trees in the background, and the sky. And a man walks into the top edge of the screen, and he starts walking down. Now, if you know slow cinema and you know these directors, you know they're not going to cut. He's going to walk all the way, he's going to walk slowly, and he's going to walk all the way out of the frame, and then, even then the director might not cut. So what do? Well, you look around, and you listen, and you hear the sound of a bus, and there's some sound of some children. Oh, maybe the bus is going to come into the shot. I wonder which direction it's going to come from. Is that bus right or left? And then the bus goes away. And you look back at the man, and he's about a third of the way down. And then you look at the goats, and there was 5 goats, and now there's only 3. 2 of them must have left while you were thinking about that bus. And now the wind is starting to come up. And wow, the wind is really blowing, and those clouds are changing patterns. Maybe a storm is coming. And now the man is halfway across the screen. And wait, is that the bus? Do I hear the bus coming again? Well, what's happening here? The viewer is making his own movie. A director is showing him a scene, and by withholding certain elements, makes the viewer active, and when the viewer gets to do something, it will always be more powerful than when the director does it for him. And so if you are going to try to get someone to reach out and try to appreciate the ineffable, the spiritual, the mystical, you can't do it for the viewer. The viewer has to do it himself. And if you do everything for the viewer won't do a damn thing. It'll just sit there. So you think of things to take away. One very clear example is what they call the delayed cut. So let's say I have a camera here and I'm shooting that back door over there. And we usually cut in cinema when someone enters or leaves. So if that man in white left, we would cut just as the door starts to close. But what if I don't? What if I just sit here on this aisle over here and look up at that door and count 1, 2, 3. Now, your eye doesn't do that. Your eye doesn't stay watching a door after someone exits. Your eye finds something else more interesting to look at. But as the director, I'm not letting you find anything else. I'm making you watch this closed door. And what happens if I count up to 6? 4, 5, 6. You're still looking at that door. Well, something is happening here. And the thing that is happening, it's not nothing. there's no way nothing is happening. Something is happening, but the thing that's happening is called duration. What yeah, Gilles Deleuze's whole theory of duration. What happens when time is forced to act upon an image? Because you are not looking at that door anymore. You're looking at that door through time. And what does that mean? And so there are, in these contemplative styles, probably 6 or 8 elements that different directors use, and they all go to the buffet, but they put different things on their plate. So no two are quite the same. So Costa is not going to be like Bellotaro, is not going to be like Angelopoulos. And they each find their own way, but they are using some of the same stylistic tools, and that's why you can have such a thing as transcendental style, because very different people, Ozu and Bresson, but they're using some of the same tools.
Since we are talking about transcendental style, I know First Reformed is your, in a 40-year directing career, is your first film that you use this style. And since it is possibly the most acclaimed one, too, critically acclaimed, I would like to ask if you are thinking in making another film according to the style, because I think everyone agrees we would like that very much.
I don't think so. I think it would have to come upon me. I've written 2 scripts since, and they're different. One is a Western, one is a crime film. You know, that style was right for that subject. I would be afraid to try it again because I got lucky and it worked, and if I try it again, it might not work and I would ruin the thing I did. And also, I'm not entirely sure I will work again. You know, I hope First Reformed isn't my last film, but if it is a very good last film, and you know, I would have no problem with it being my last film.
Okay, I'm going to make you one last question, and I think then I can give the word to the audience. American cinema has changed a lot since New Hollywood. I wonder if you feel nostalgia for the 70s and what you think are the most important differences you think that have occurred in films and in the production system. I wonder if you want to give a comment on that.
Well, there were a lot of important films in the 70s, not because the filmmakers were better, but because the audiences were better. And we had a period of unease around the world over issues like homosexuality, sexual freedom, women's rights, civil rights, military, so forth. And people had a lot of questions, and they turned to movies with these questions, and movies started providing answers. You know, so Bob and Ted and Alice about wife swapping, or Coming Home about Vietnam, or An Unmarried Woman about women's liberation. And when people take movies seriously, it's easy to make serious movies. And if audiences want serious movies, you'll get some really good ones. And so you don't need, I don't think the filmmakers alive today, working today rather, are any better or worse than they were in the 70s. Maybe they're probably worse, but the audiences are so much, maybe the 70s were probably not as good as the ones today. But the audiences were so good in the 70s that almost every single week there would be some film to come out to address these social issues. Now, we don't have audiences anymore. We have fragmented megabits of audiences, and they don't come together to discuss anything through the arts. And arts have a hell of a hard time now being in the center of the conversation, because people don't look to movies to understand things. They're all cubicled off in their social networks and in their ideological feedback loops that these figures, these in culture, that combined culture, like a newsman like Walter Cronkite, or a singer like Bruce Springsteen, or a singer a comedian like Johnny Carson. People, all different kinds of people would watch these phenomena together. Now, more and more people, their arts are simply determined by an ideological niche. And so I think the thing that was lost wasn't the filmmakers, it was the audiences.
Who wants to make the first question? The first is the bravest in the room.
I would like to ask, you have once said about American Gigolo, that is your third film, that it was thanks to that film and to the collaboration with art director Ferdinando Scarfiotti that you learned how to think visually. I wonder if you can talk us a little bit about this. What is this definition of your thinking visually, and how it changed your cinema from then onwards?
Well, the background I was raised in, that if you wanted to say something, you usually said it with words or song. You didn't say it with images. The churches were very bare. They looked like courtrooms. And so I never really thought about images as being ideas. And then when I got to Los Angeles, I started realizing that images are ideas too. So this right here, this glass, that's an idea. You can use words to describe it, but it is not words. It's an image. And every time it turns or twists, it becomes a new idea. And so you start to think about, what is the visual logic of my story? And when I write a script, I don't think about visual logic. I just think about the fundamentals of writing, character, theme, dialogue, plot. And then after I finish writing, I go back to the script and try to attack it as if it were done by another writer, and look at it and say, how can I bring this terrible script to visual life? How can I rethink it? And then you go over to the other side of your brain and you start rethinking things. So I tend to write as a writer and direct as a director. I try to keep them somewhat separate. So that you have to learn the visual language. So the first film or two, I was just illustrating. By the time the third one came along, and because of Scarfiotti, who had been the production designer on Last Tango and Conformist, and Bertolucci films, and who had such a clear and odd visual world. And if you look at Conformist, it's full of things where they're using one location for an opposite purpose. It's just completely an imagination that is visually unfettered. And there was a social group around Nando, and I sort of came into that social group, and there was also the social group of American Gigolo. And that's where I learned. That's where I learned how to transmit verbal ideas into visual ones. And because I'll just give you an example. So the opening of the film, there was a house in Malibu. And and he, Nando was out location scouting because I put him in charge of everything visual, location scouting, sets, makeup, wardrobe. He was in charge of everything visual, and he couldn't find that house in Malibu when we wanted to shoot it the first week. I kept saying, Malibu was full of those houses. Why don't you just go out and pick one? He said, no, I can't find it. I can't find it. And then one day he came in and he said, I think I found it. And so we went over there. And he said, now ignore the inside of the house. I'm going to put up plasterboard flats. I'm going to redo the entire interior. So just ignore what's here now. But come with me outside. That discussion they have, I think that discussion should occur right around 4:30 when the tide is moving in, and there's these big concrete pylons that they had just set in because the house was brand new, and they had these concrete strips that were left over from the cardboard casings, and he said they should walk in and out of these pylons as the water is coming up to their feet, and the sun is right about there, and that's where you should do that scene. And I did. What I realized, of course, is that he had just created a Milanese arcade in the middle of Malibu, and with that kind of visual information.
You were talking a little while ago that you write as a writer and you direct as a director. Do you prefer the writing phase or the directing phase?
I usually give the answer that Truffaut gave. He said, when I'm writing, I like directing best. When I'm directing, I like editing best. And when I'm editing, I like writing best. Writing, you have a lot of freedom because the world is as big as your imagination. But it's kind of lonely. And directing, you don't have so much freedom. You're confined by weather, by logistics, by human talent, budget. So it's not very, you don't feel the freedom you did when you were writing. But it is very communal. And that's very enjoyable too. Just to go out in the morning and have 100 people say, good morning.
A gentleman over there wants to know what are your thoughts on affliction nowadays?
I think that is probably an almost perfect adaptation of that book. I think I absolutely got it right. I had picked that book up in a bookshop, and I liked how it opened. I contacted the writer, I got the rights, and the writer became a longtime friend of mine. And I really think I did that book justice. And that's what I'm most proud of. Again, now, I was thinking, and talking about visual style, I was thinking of making this very robust visually, like Comfort of Strangers, where the camera almost never stops. And Paul Sarasi, who was the DP, and I we were going through all these various camera moves. And then I went into rehearsals, and we started rehearsing. I came back, found Sarasi, and I said, all those camera moves we were talking about? I said, we're not going to do them, because I just saw the most interesting thing in this entire movie, and it's Nick Nolte's face. And that's where we should be. We should just be watching Nick. And that's an example of how you adapt as a director. But Nick's performance is really quite extraordinary.
But it's interesting because even though it is an adaptation, it seems almost that you were the writer, because it reminded me a lot of Taxi Driver when I first saw it. There is this obsessed, self-destructive character that goes in a violent journey, And then there is this cathartic, violent moment in which he kills his father. I wonder if you think the same about that.
Well, you know, I think it was Renoir who said every director has one film in him. He just figures out different ways to make it. And I think that you know, you Taxi Driver, like Sleeper, Gigolo, Walker, Affliction, First Reformed, they're all sort of about that same guy. Usually it is a guy with me. And I made a couple of films about women, but mostly it's about a certain kind of man. And the nice thing about DNA, about Affliction, is that it allowed me to get another little angle at it, because the brother angle, because this is a story that's being told to you by a younger brother. This is not a story you are watching per se. It's a story that's being related to you, and so that kind of prism influences the film.
The nice lady over there wants to know if you can talk about the sacred and profane in your films.
Well, there hasn't been much sacred. There's been a lot of religious references, you know. Even Last Temptation of Christ, which Marty directed, there's a lot of religious stuff in there, but I don't know how sacred it is. It's more about the human struggle of Jesus than the divine. And so it wasn't until First Reformed that I really thought I would try to get people to elevate themselves rather than just identify. So, like when I first met Ethan Hawke on this, I said, you know what a recessive performance is? And he said, yeah. I said, no, every time you feel the viewer getting interested in what you're saying, lean back. And if they're still interested, lean back a little further. See how far you can lean away from them before they'll get up and leave. And that's what has to happen in a recessive performance. At a contemplative film, you keep taking things away until the viewer either is going to leave the room or he's going to come to you. And so First Reformed was the first time I had attempted that. Usually, you know, I used psychological realism much more. Together they just showed autofocus, which is, you know, a film I like, which is actually a lot of fun. I didn't think of that as a serious movie. I didn't think of Bob Crane as a serious guy, and so I just sort of had fun with it. You know, that crazy male-male relationship of those two, you know, bozos, and just tickled me to death.
Even though that First Reformed is the first time you've tried to make the sacred, there is an interesting thing in your career that is the reference you make to pickpocket, at least in the ending of American Gigolo and Light Sleeper. It seems that, yes.
It was a mistake to do it in American Gigolo. It didn't feel right. It felt like I had just grafted it on, stitched it on. It didn't feel like it had come out of the movie. So when I was writing Light Sleeper, I was thinking, how do I end this one? And then I thought to myself, this is the one that should have the pig cracker in it, not American Gigolo. And I said, well, why don't you just steal it again? This time you steal it for the right reasons. So I just stole it again.
Allow me to disagree with you. I think American Gigolo, the ending is really beautiful because you have this narcissistic character all the film and he is unable to express genuine love, and that last shot is beautiful because finally he is able to love another human being. He's not thinking about himself anymore. So
yeah, but yeah, of course, you know, stylistically, never mind. I agree with you.
We were talking about Renoir. You mentioned Renoir, and I saw this article in which you make your film canon. And in the number one spot, even though you love Bresson and Pickpocket, it's perhaps the most important reference in your filmic career, the number one spot is occupied by The Rules of the Game. I ask you, why do you think The Rules of the Game is the greatest film of all time?
Well, I think it's a combination of all the different wonderful things a movie can be. The different characters, the different themes, the inventiveness of the camera work, the political relevance of that moment. It's like, the reason I pick it is, it was after someone said to me, if you had to pick one film to stand in for all films, which one would you take? Well, you wouldn't take Pickpocket to stand in for all films. You wouldn't take Tokyo Story, but you would take Rules of the Game and say, this is what a movie is like.
Back to Taxi Driver and First Reformed, there is something that I find quite interesting in these two films, that is, they seem almost brothers, because there are these very disturbed characters, guilt-ridden, I think, even in the case of Travis Bickle, because we don't know what he made in Vietnam. And they clearly wish death, but they are incapable of committing suicide. And so they feel this strange need to become martyrs for some cause. I wonder if you think the same?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting about First Reformed is you have a sick man, and he has the sickness that Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, despair, angst. And so he is on a kind of death spiral. He says, I'm going to write a journal for 1 year, and what's going to happen after that year? And he's using various things to try to heal himself. He's using the journal, he's using the vestments of the church, the liturgy of the church, the alcohol. He's trying to find a way out of this dark place. And then he meets this boy who reminds him of his son and who kills himself. And he catches the boy's virus. I don't know if he really was an environmental activist, but he catches that boy's virus. And the reason it's so attractive to him is that, St. Augustine told the early church that suicide was a sin. Anyone who kills himself is committing a mortal sin, but with one exception. Samson was not a sinner. Samson was a martyr who brought down God's enemies with his own death. So all of a sudden, Toller is no longer a suicidal sinner. He's a potential martyr. Well, this is a very creepy line of thought, and it's essentially jihadism. And it often shows up in Christianity because I call it the pathology of suicidal glory. It's this notion that you can contribute to your own redemption with your own pain. Now, what Christianity teaches is that Jesus suffered for us. He doesn't need us to suffer anymore. But the temptation to suffer, to be like Jesus, to suffer like Jesus, to whip yourself on the back, to starve yourself, that's a real, it's a natural temptation, and that may in fact be the greater sin than killing oneself. The temptation to act like God, to affect your own salvation. So, so that's what makes First Reformed so sort of creepy, because you see him moving into martyrdom, and it just feels very wrong. And often when you have young Christians go off the rails. This is often how they go off the rails. They start confusing their own suffering with Jesus. So that made that a very interesting situation.
Can you talk about the canyons, because it is a film for post-theatrical audiences, the way it was thought. What do you think about the film?
Well, I mean, that came about. Bret Easton Ellis and I were going to do a different film, and that fell apart. And I was just talking to Bret, I said, the technology is changing so fast. It's possible now to just make a film. You can pay for it yourself. Why don't you write it, I'll direct it, and we'll just make it. See if we can do this. And part of the temptation, the fun of doing that film was the experiment. Can I pull this off? Can I make a film for $150,000? Funded off the internet, cast it off the internet. And of course, it gave us the freedom to do anything we wanted, because it was our own money. We had no insurance for anything. So I cast Lindsay Lohan, who is uncastable because she can't get insured, and Bret wanted me to use this porn star that he liked, and then James Dean, and he turned out to be, I thought, really, deliciously part of that millennial malaise of that generation. And so it was really a great experiment. We sold the film, everybody made money. And it's something that I really enjoyed doing once. I don't think I'd ever do it again. It's a lot of work.
Which one of your films do you like the best?
Well, you like different films for different reasons. Mishima is probably the most unique, the most experimental. Even though it's been many decades, there's no other film like it. And so you sort of, that makes you proud to say, wow, I did that odd thing. I actually did it. I pulled it off. I got it financed. I made it. And and there's other films that strike you quite a bit personally, like Light Sleeper strikes me personally. Other films where you really like your direction. Comfort of Strangers, I really like the direction in that film. So just like parents love their children for different reasons, the same thing with your film. And that is not to say that I think they're all good. They're not. There's nothing quite so humbling as when you realize that you are the person who fucked up your own film.
Since we're talking about Mishima, there's something I've noticed in your filmic work, that is, even though you have written a book about Ozu, the values that you import from the Japanese culture are quite different in your films. That is, you only focus on the self-destructive side of the Japanese. You never have these family duty values that Ozu shows. Instead, the things that you brought from Japan to your films were the Yakuza and Mishima, so self-destruction. Would you like to give a comment on that?
Yeah, with the origin of Mishima, I had written Taxi Driver, and I wanted to return to that theme, the pathology of self-destruction, the pathology of suicidal glory. And I was writing a script on Hank Williams, and we couldn't get the music rights. And I said, I shouldn't be writing about Hank Williams. He's just another dumb American kid, like Travis. If I really want to write about this theme again, I need to go to a completely other environment. I need to go to the other side of the bookcase. And my brother had told me about Mishima and his death. I said, now here we have a man, very successful, praised around the world, family man, homosexual man, multi-talented artist, wealthy, yet caught in the vice of that same pathology of suicidal glory. said that's who I should make a film about if I really wanted to look at this mythology from opposite sides. And so that was what brought me into Mishra. And someone said, this was an article that just came out this year, and I think they're probably right. It said, this film is not about Mishra. This film is about Schrader's Mishra. And, that's really sort of what it's about. History just happened to give me a character like the ones I would normally write.
What advice do you wish to give to young screenwriters and young directors?
Well, there's two different questions. But, first of all, if you can find a modicum of happiness doing anything else, do it. Because the odds of failure and of dejection and rejection are very high. So you have to be kind of obsessive about it. You also have to be very calculating. But here's something that is useful for young writers. Young writers have a tendency to look at a movie and try to do a movie like that one. I'm going to do a superhero movie or a crime movie or whatever. And they're imitating a movie they already saw. And that's no way to break into the industry, because they got plenty of people who can imitate the movies that they already saw, and they're all working. They don't need you. They don't need you to imitate that movie. They need you to do something they haven't realized that they need yet. And so you have to look into yourself and say, what is it that I can bring to this marketplace that they can only get from me? And that's what you keep in mind. Also, it's important to realize that screenwriting is not really a function of writing. It's a function of storytelling. It's part of the oral tradition. You don't really write a movie, you tell it. And that when I teach screenwriting, I teach that kind of presentation. You have a problem, you find a metaphor, you find a story, and then you start telling the story. And every time you tell it, you watch who you're telling it to and work on the story, just like you would be a stand-up comedian. And if you can tell a story for 45 minutes, you have a movie. And and one of two things will happen at some point if you're telling a story repeatedly to a friend. Say, let me buy you a beer or coffee, I want to tell you a story. Either you will get sick of the story will fall apart, and that will be a great day for you, because you've just saved yourself the work of writing a script that people don't want to see. Or the opposite will happen, and the script will get sick of being told, and will say, okay, enough of this. Let's start writing now. And that's how I began, and that's how I still write. Now that only really works, on original scripts and speculation scripts. I began writing on spec, and I'm still writing on spec.
Okay, then I think it's over. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
It was an honor.